Philippe, my friend, thank you again for joining us today. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast to share some of your wisdom, your expertise in storytelling with our listeners. I'm really excited to dig into today's conversation. But before we dive in, I'm going to ask you a question, kind of a little bit one of our go-to icebreakers on the podcast. But my first question for you, just for our listeners to get to know you, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and then what brought you to the for good sector? And I mean, you've been here for a while now. What's kept you as long as it has?
Sure thing. Yeah. So I am Philippe. I live in San Diego. I live here with my family, married, dad to three young kids, 4, 2, and 2 right now. That's twins. And
Wow.
so, yeah, that definitely has my life pretty active. And as we'll talk about, I work at a nonprofit called Plant with Purpose. Actually, I just found out today is my 7th anniversary there. So hit that
Congratulations.
right. Thank you. And yeah, I on the side illustrate. I do improv. So I've always had like this eclectic mix of hobbies, and travel is another one. I guess it's kind of a bigger endeavor, so a
Mm-hmm.
different scale than illustration in terms of effort involved. But I've always just wanted to, work in a way that incorporated as many of my interests and
Mm-hmm.
curiosities as possible. The idea of getting up and doing the same thing every day kind of put a bad taste in my mouth. I wanted to kind of go to the opposite end of the spectrum and mix it up a lot. And it turns out taking the role of being at least at the start of my tenure with Plant with Purpose, being a one-person marketing team
Mm-hmm.
at a mid-sized but growing nonprofit will have you wearing a ton of different hats
Yes,
at once.
absolutely.
Yeah, but even before that, I think I was in high school when I found out what a nonprofit even was, and just seeing people who were working in this realm where folks were so energized by the mission that they were working towards, by a cause. I was particularly excited by international causes that kind of
Mm-hmm.
went in line with some of the travel experiences I had. Seeing that drive and that commitment, and also that just sense of purpose beyond just going to work every day out of necessity was motivating. It was the energy, the atmosphere, everything I wanted to be around. I wanted to be a part of that.
That's awesome. Well, first off, congratulations on your anniversary. 7
Thanks.
years doing anything at this point is impressive. But let alone, man, I can barely fathom the cumulative impact, the stories you've told, the missions you've communicated, the campaigns you've run. I can't even imagine the cumulative impact of that over the last 7 years. So congratulations. And even more reason why I'm excited to dig in with you today, because I think you're just going to be a wealth of knowledge for our audience and for us as we get to listen back to this and dig into the content ourselves. So thank you again for joining us. I want to jump in. I mean, there's so much for us to go into in this topic of storytelling, and specifically the angle of ethical storytelling. I think is such a critical piece in the next generation of for good leadership. And for good
Mhm.
storytelling is ethical storytelling. Rather than me trying to define it, I would love to get your definition and your overview of what even ethical storytelling is.
Yeah, definitely. I love that question. And I don't know if I have like a single definition from it, so I'm just going to riff off the dome here, but I think it's a process. First of all, there are some great resources out there. Plant with Purpose, the organization I work for, we're assigned on to just the Ethical Storytelling Pact. That's on ethicalstorytelling.org, and that just outlines a lot of concrete steps that comprise, yeah, an ethical storytelling practice. I think on top of the concrete steps of it, though, I think is this constant sense of wanting to minimize harm and maximize upholding the dignity of the people you're telling stories of. Whenever one of our program participants shares their experiences with me, and I one of the things I love about my role is I often regularly have the chance to go out into the areas that we work and to hear stories firsthand. And whenever I have that experience, it's a big reminder that this is a really generous act on
Mm-hmm.
behalf of our participants, on behalf of those who are telling their stories with me. First of all, it's a generous act in terms of time. The people we work with are rural subsistence farmers for the most part. And so the time they're spending with us is time away from their farm that's vital for their livelihood. On top of that, they're being generous just with their experience. It's a
Mhm.
vulnerable act to share a story. Sometimes that vulnerability required is multiplied by the fact that it's across cultural barriers.
Mhm.
There may be gender or age things going on that increase that. So just remembering like that is an act of generosity and an act of trust. And they're sharing that also for a reason, for getting their experiences and stories out there with the aim of that broader awareness and connection, helping their community in the long run. And so, with that big picture in mind, when I am given a story, don't feel so much like I am the originator of a story, kind of just diving into creative philosophy. I don't know if anyone ever is, but in this scenario, I especially am not. I'm more so kind of a steward of it,
Mhm.
taking it from, people who are willing to share and wanting it to land with the audience to foster and build that sense of connection.
I began my career and spent most of my career as a fundraising consultant. And a lot of that is telling the stories of lives impacted through an organization's cause in a way that motivates generous people to choose to be philanthropic in that direction, to give to that cause. And so much of my experience, and the storytelling was scientific and meticulous and granular, and we choose this image because the person is looking in this direction and it's going to cause the reader to feel this, or the person on the other end of the screen to feel this. But so little of it traditionally is, how do we empower the person behind the story to be the hero of the story, because they are, whether it's a homeless shelter and they're telling the story of a person who courageously stepped off the street, stepped through the front door and joined a program to not just get a meal and shelter for the night, but to turn their life around, or the story of a mom who is courageously standing in line to receive a box of food from a Feeding America location.
Hmm.
How do we tell those critical stories without, one, sacrificing the impact of telling a story well? Because these are stories that are emotional and are powerful and need to be told in a way that motivates people who have the ability to give even more generously than they thought they could. How do we do that while balancing, the term that is really catching on right now, and that I think is so telling of where we've taken it, is poverty porn.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strong image to depict the way that we've swung the pendulum almost too far in the story of leaning into the pain of and the power of the stories that we tell as fundraisers. So how do we balance that line between, ethical storytelling but not losing the power and the impact and the need?
Ooh, I love this question. There's a lot there to unpack. Yeah, first, one of the things that first comes to mind is this thing that Luis Castellanos, he's the director of our Plant with Purpose program in Mexico, frequently says. It's that poverty is not a character trait. It's not a personality. It's not a part of someone's identity. It's just a condition. And so, in remembering that, if you're just going through like the mechanics of how to set up a good story, how to frame it, and everything, and if you're trying to flesh out a character and to build a character and to establish that, poverty isn't a character trait. It's not. It doesn't add dimensionality to a character. It's an obstacle. That's kind of where it fits in, and it's a set of conditions, but it's not core to that person's identity. And so, yeah, we're asking how do we balance like telling an effective story, and you mentioned a lot of the kind of the frameworks and the structures that you can learn. And I actually really love learning about those things. They're fascinating. And yeah, I think in the long run, learning that stuff does make you a more effective storyteller and more empowered to tell stories that effectively move the needle where they need to
Mhm.
be moved if you have an understanding of how those things work. But to look at it that way helps you understand where these things go. Where does poverty fit into the story? Not as a character trait, not as a personality, but as the obstacle. And so it makes you realize, like, well, we still need to flesh this person out with a full identity, not just as someone living in poverty, but what else is going to connect us to this person? What are shared things that people might be able to relate to? Is it that this person is a mother, a young mother? I have twins. I frequently see stories of twins, and every time that happens, I'm like, ooh, okay. I
Mhm.
see you, fellow twin parent. And even more than that, just things that, I love just the really very specific details that sometimes get thrown into our stories that oftentimes seem like they might not be core to explaining how our program and how it functions. But I realized by throwing in something like, I don't know, a person's preference, like the fact that someone has a passion for coffee in particular or something like that, just adds that layer of humanity
Mm-hmm.
and builds that. And having that, I think, is really core to having a story that's both ethical and effective. When I go on field visits and I get to spend time with participants, I often try and start filming days as much as I'm able to with something that can just really build rapport and humanize the situation. Yeah, and I've loved being able to share cups of coffee that people have brewed that they've grown themselves, that they've taken
That's
pride
cool.
in.
Yeah.
I've yeah, I when I was last in Mexico, the gentleman who we spent time interviewing had also spent some time as a migrant worker in the U.S. out of necessity, and so he had a lot of work in back kitchens of restaurants. And so just being able to joke with him about things in restaurants, things just establishing a rapport on the level
Mm-hmm.
of a sense of humor was excellent. And I think, yeah, just being able to see the humanity in other people, and that includes things like preferences and humor and all that, is a foundation to build off of.
I love that. Poverty is a condition, not a character trait. And I don't think that I think that'll stick with me for the rest of my career. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna take that, and every time I write a brief or every time I tell a story, I'm gonna be using that, because that's such a critical reminder and such a critical framework when we're telling stories of people who are impoverished, but the person who is impoverished, that's not their character, that's not their defining trait, that is not even a trait that should define them. That is a
Mhm.
condition that they are experiencing. I love that. So thank you for sharing that. The next thing I kind of want to dig into is more a little tactical than philosophical, which we've been talking, but a tactical. And this one is going to stir up a lot of feathers. But there's a lot of good conversation happening right now about who should be the hero, particularly when we're talking about marketing and fundraising. Who should be the hero? Should it be the organization? Should it be the donor? Or should it be the people who are receiving the support of the organization? So, in your case, you talk a lot about the people in rural Mexico or Africa, or the nations that you visit that are facing economic hardship because of climate change. You know, are those the people who are the hero of the stories, or is your organization the hero of the stories, or is the donor who's reading the appeal, do we make them the hero of the stories, or what is that balance? I have an opinion. I'm not going to share it just yet because I don't want to sway yours, but I want to hear your take on this, because this is, I think, a really important topic and trend that's happening in storytelling right now.
Sure, yeah. I think it's not our organization. There's one way to look at it where you could see how the donor is the hero, and there's also a way in which our partners, our participants, are the hero. I think both are valid, but I also want to highlight that sometimes I use the word protagonist rather than hero,
Mm-hmm.
partly because when you hear hero, that's associated with like heroic qualities, superheroes or Greek heroes, even,
Mm-hmm.
and that might start to set the stage where we're expecting superhuman things out of this individual, when really like an actual hero of a story and a protagonist is that because of their humanity, because of the things that make them human, the things they overcome, their vulnerabilities and uncertainties. So sometimes I use protagonist. Now, to go through the angle at which like the donor is the hero or the protagonist, there's this increasingly popular way of thinking of marketing, not just nonprofit marketing, but any marketing, where the customer is the hero, and the organization that has the product is more like the mentor type that's guiding them. And if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, it kind of follows like the hero's journey and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is in that category of kind of marketing nerd science that I actually love, and I do think has a lot of value. And our team does try and map things out by that framework to see if we can make our messaging resonate more and to see how it's more effective. So, in that sense, our donors are our heroes of that storyline. Our partners are also heroes of that storyline too, though. They fit the bill. There's that call to action, that moment where they realize what they're up against. We're reversing two of the world's biggest problems in rural poverty and climate change. and the severity of that that our partners live with every day is this persistent call to action and this invitation that comes along that to do something differently, to start planting trees and farming regeneratively. And so seeing that, that those decisions do come with risk. It's always a risk to do something different than what you've done before, especially a lot of the folks in our program who are early adopters. And so there's a lot of heroism and overcoming obstacles in that. And again, our organization, our local leaders there are again in the mentor guide role. But we have this phrase that's kind of been just this rallying cry of our organization, right? That I think kind of ties these two ends together, and it's partners, not projects.
Hmm.
The fleshed out version of that is like the people we work with are our partners, not our projects. And I think maybe even more so than hero or protagonist, that defines the process. Like we're forming partnerships with these rural communities so that when a village in Thailand sees its ecosystem healed, its water sources restored, its forest expand, it's not just because we came in there and did those things, but it's also because that process was owned by the local community,
Hmm. Yeah, I
and
love that.
because it was supported by people on the other side of the world who were making that possible through their funding and financial support. And so,
Hmm.
yes, partners, not projects, in the direction of our program for sure. We've also talked about how this applies to our supporters. They're also our partners,
Hmm.
and not just we've made an alternate version which we use more internally, but I'll just share it. They're our partners, not our pocketbooks. They're not just our sources of revenue, but they're really our partners in making this happen too, and they provide input and feedback, and they're on this journey as well. And so, yeah, I like that hero analogy partly because I love just studying the art of
Hmm.
storytelling and seeing where that overlaps with favorite movies and classic literature. But I also like to think of how that expands in multiple directions.
Yeah, I really like reframing too, even the word hero, because in storytelling, choosing the words you use matters. So when we're talking about storytelling, even intentionally change, like it's not a hero, it's a protagonist. Whose perspective are we telling the story from? And I think that also reshapes some of it to allow us to focus on telling stories authentically, ethically, but to the from the lens of the person who we want to hear the story, right? Because you do want to you want to tell a story differently in fundraising than you do when you're telling it in a newsletter or an annual report or even something as simple as an article on your website. You're telling that story differently than if you were putting it on a social media post or running a fundraising ad or sending a campaign appeal. So I do think even reframing from the word hero to protagonist, I like that a lot. Philippe, I'm going to switch gears on us a little bit here. We've talked, some tactical things, some philosophical things. But now I want to switch gears because you're not only just are you a fantastic storyteller, you're also a TEDx speaker. I had the chance to, and we'll link it when we share this episode. I got the chance to listen to your TED talk. It was fantastic. And one of the points you brought up in there reminded me of a session colleague Aaron Booker gave at the nonprofit storytelling conference last year titled Stories Move and Numbers Prove. And I kind of want to you had said it in a similar way in your TED talk, and I want to unpack that concept where as good storytellers in our sector, we need to use the power of the stories that we have in combination with the numbers to show the efficacy of the way that we can partner with funders and people who are on the other side of the mission. So I want to unpack this concept a little bit of how do we successfully combine the emotional power of good storytelling with the logical connectivity of using numbers and statistics in a way that drive home the value of those stories.
Yeah, I love that. In a lot of ways, I think you underscored the way I've started to think about the relationship more between those two sides of the coin. You might have already gathered from some of my other answers, but I am not the type to put many things in a rigid box.
Hmm.
And so I often remind myself and the team that, in a way, data is storytelling and storytelling is data. But of course, they take place in two different languages, often appealing to two very different ways of thought. As we're recording this, we're finishing up conducting this in-depth impact evaluation that we do across our program every 3 years. It's only every 3 years because it's such a robust process, but it really applies these analytics to see what's the actual impact of all our activities across the board. Is it having the results we're intending? And we try and learn from those things. And just this morning, I was in conversation with a couple members of our monitoring and evaluation team, and we were talking about that relationship between the statistics and the stories. And it was essentially what you described: the stories move and the numbers prove. And I see this dynamic where I receive stories from our partners internationally all the time. Part of what I do is process them and check the translations and relay them to our communications team at large. But yeah, as I see these stories come in, they are incredibly moving and powerful. But and then you want to make sure that, like, okay, are these stories just the outliers, like the best of the best? Or is there more where that came from, you know? And, I often get the stories in a bundle of 4 or 5, so seeing more of them is helpful. That's good. That indicates, yeah, there's more than one. This wasn't just an outlier, but still, is there more? And then we run the numbers and we look at the data and we see things like we have a 55% reduction in poverty in the communities we work with.
Mm-hmm.
We see increases in the amount of girls who are able to go to school because of the changes in their community. We see changes in behavior in adopting healthier farming practices. And we know that the stories we're reading are not just these standout exceptions,
Mm-hmm.
but they're the norm. And while the stories we tell are good ones, it's also highly likely that if you met a random member from our community, you'd hear similar stories. You'd hear similar accomplishments and similar struggles that they've overcome. Some might be more unique in terms of like their family structure and how that adds to it, but a lot of times the process, yeah, you can all tell that it's related, and that's highly encouraging. And you see that verified by the numbers. And since I have the opportunity to visit too, it's that kind of adds another dimension. Just seeing those numbers and that all come to life, and yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things you talked about in your TED talk that I thought is really has broader application. You talked specifically in the context of global warming, and you said essentially, the numbers are so large and staggering that people don't really think they can make a difference. And I think that's something that I've seen a lot of for good professionals struggle with in storytelling is like, hey, we've got this cause. It is a massive world problem. We're here to address it. Why aren't people leaning in with us? And where I see it is like, hey, we've got this massive global problem, but if you can't materialize it to the perspective of one person's impact, then you've got an issue that's not actionable. And the last thing we want is to be leading a cause where people don't feel like they can take the action that we know they can. So real tactically here, spinning this as we wind down, real tactically, how have you successfully taken this concept of, the impact of global warming across the world? That is a huge impact that is hard for probably almost anyone to fully fathom and understand. How have you made that something that, for lack of a better term, is digestible at the individual level?
Yeah, some wheels were turning while you were speaking. I was just thinking of how funny measurement carbon dioxide metric tons of CO2 equivalent is. That's like a really common way that people
Mm-hmm.
measure their emissions, right? But first of all, CO2 that's invisible. Equivalents, so not just CO2, but things that are equivalent to it, and then tons, so the weight of an invisible thing, but it's also metric. So, like, especially if you're an American, now you have to jump through all these hoops that lead you with this really abstract score. And I'm not trying to throw shade at the. It's actually really helpful to have these numbers that can allow you to measure the impact. But that only means something if you see what that number translates to. Yeah. And I think, one thing that helps me is being a sports fan, right? Like, sports fans actually care a lot about statistics.
Mm-hmm.
At least a lot of them do, right? People will debate over and over, whether like players were better, looking at different numbers, talking about like how much does batting average really tell you, and batting average, if you start to unpack it, is actually kind of an abstract thing, like you mean a really good guy only succeeds 30% of the time. But that matters not because people are obsessed with like percentages measured to three digits, but because that translates to whether or not a team can win a game, whether or not this is a guy you want to be at bat when the stakes are high. And so, what do CO2 equivalents, metric tons of those? What does that matter? It matters if a farmer you met is going to be able to feed his kids, the next day, if the birds that you've heard singing growing up are going to be around for your kids to be hearing in the same forest as they grow up. These are concrete things that add weight to these statistics, and once you can feel that weight, then those statistics matter. Then you're like, oh yeah, every like slice of a degree of temperature change is important, because within that degree, that's representing ecosystems and species and lives and food and all these tangible things.
Yes, exactly. And I just one thing, totally unrelated, but um, you talked about batting averages. This is why I chose to be a pitcher. I could be an average pitcher and succeed 80% of the time, but you're an average hitter. You don't. So that was a total anecdote, but I'm right there with you on that. But yeah, it really is. I don't think we properly grasp the magnitude of the need to be able to translate massive need into personal impact. But also, I don't think good storytellers in our sector get enough credit for how well that they can paint the picture of abstract global scale to the impact of an individual. Well, just like you talked about, that framing of, hey, your metric ton of CO2 equivalent is actually could be the difference between walking your grandchildren through the forest you grew up hiking in. Like, that is a powerful perspective to understand individually the impact that has globally. And you did that so eloquently and smooth because of your experience. But there are so many early for good professionals or people who are trying to establish themselves in storytelling. I think that's such an important piece, is understanding the ability to translate these massive goals into individual impact bite-sized chunks. So thank you for walking us through that. Philippe, as we get ready to close here, I think we've covered, even just such a short amount of time, we've covered a lot of ground, between philosophical perspectives on ethical storytelling to practically how we translate these large goals into relevant personal impact. The last thing I want to cover, and this is just fun for me as much as I hope it is for our listeners, is I just want to hear a story about one of your favorite stories you've gotten to tell and why it was your favorite.
There's so many, it's going to be hard to choose from, but I'm going to go with one that probably has some recency to it. About a year ago, I got to visit our program in Ethiopia, one of our newer program sites. And I got to spend a week in Ethiopia. Incredibly fascinating country. It's more or less the only African country to never be colonized. And so there's so much cultural history that just stretches back, and has a little more, yeah, just preservation around it. And I got to see so much of that. One thing that I found just so different while I was in the country was just a very strong layer of separation in social settings between men and women. Probably one of the more gender stratified countries I'd been to. And it was just something that, in like physical spaces you could observe, everyone kind of keeping to themselves. And, that's about what one would observe in a week's time. But it also became clear that just one thing that translated to was just less opportunity for women overall to advance economically and socially and everything. I met this woman named Azmara, and she lived in a rural part of the country, and she wanted to join our program. She wanted to earn an income. She had some business ideas. She was a skilled weaver and wanted to expand her business to be able to sell some of her goods in the city. And the thing that stood out to me was the amount of opposition she got from that. She had this drive, she had the skill, she had all the right things, was willing to invest in herself. Members of her community gave her all kinds of reasons not to do that. Some of it comes from this fractured trust just between the NGO world and communities in Ethiopia that's gone back decades long before we've been there. So that was a contributing factor. The gender dynamic for sure was a contributing factor, and a lot of people were telling her to just marry somebody and settle, essentially. And what stood out to me was just her fortitude and just her knowing, her confidence in knowing that she had this ability and that this was finally an opportunity through which she would have the chance to act on it. And so she did. She participated in our group program. One of the components is a savings and lending program that allowed her to invest more in her weaving business. She did that. She also ended up supporting her fiance to get through school. He trained as a barber, so he ended up starting his own haircutting business. She was pregnant at the time that we talked to her, so now she has a kid that she's supporting with these activities. And most of all, you've seen this flip in her entire community with how the community takes to people and women participating in the program. We worked with an Ethiopian filmmaker to capture some of these stories. That's another thing we do, is try and work with local talent as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why I love doing that is because he was not only translating for us the direct interviews, but he could overhear the side conversations. And he said, yeah, there's been skepticism of this sort of program in this community for a long time, and you can still hear evidence of it, but it's also clear that has flipped.
Mm-hmm.
That barrier has been broken, and there's now a willingness to participate and a sense that things could really improve through doing so. And I think of early adopters like Asmara are key, really going against the grain, really doubling down in their own belief. It's a leap of faith on their end, and seeing what can come of it. So it made me appreciate who our partners are, what they're doing, and yeah, where that leads.
Awesome. Well, Philippe, as we get ready to close here, closing question, going to bring us down to very tactical levels, but do you have, a couple best practices or tips for someone who's, listening to this podcast and going, I want to level up my storytelling game? What are 2 or 3 things someone can do, start trying now, to become a better storyteller?
Oh man. Go on. I'll go with some of the things that have really stood out to me though. Is number one, create more space for it. And that can be interpreted a number of different ways. But the more you want to hear a person tell their own story in their own words, the more you realize that, yeah, you want to create the conditions for that to happen. A lot of our storytelling that I started with was done through questionnaires. And
Mm-hmm.
that was fine. That was getting us some good stories we could work with or everything. But I quickly realized that like these series of rapid fire, like 15 to 20 questions was getting very much like, let me just answer this question and get you what you need. It wasn't prompting people to really think about their experiences and reflect them. And so we shifted. We asked fewer questions. We don't want to just ask questions for the sake of questions, especially when it's taking someone's time. We really want to prompt them. And our questions are, I think, moving in the direction of becoming more open, so we can get a sense for what's most important to people. We don't necessarily want to assume that. And so we want to give as much space for people to highlight that. When we go on trips, I try and schedule in blocks of filming that aren't so much like, I always get asked for a shot list beforehand, but I also say, like, I also want to spend time with the community and see what they're excited to show us and go film that, because their excitement is likely going to be an incredible story. When I'm working with somebody, making sure they have they've adopted that mindset of creating the space for it. You don't want to rush the process. I've worked with a lot of great filmmakers, and I know there's a lot of craft that goes into like setting up your equipment right and getting the right shot and stuff. Much throughout a day, we want to have the space to make those connections. And then the other thing I'll say, that practice that we've really found a lot of value in, that we're trying to build off of, is as much as possible working with local talent. I mentioned hiring an Ethiopian filmmaker last year. His name was Yekino, and he was incredible. Just the level of proximity that he brought us to our partners. He was able to put our partners at ease while conducting the shoots. He also had the sensibility for what makes a good story and how to capture that visually and everything. But to know that he had that insider insight, he was more perceptive to things, especially around age and gender, that us outsiders would have missed. And I know, like, some places we work, that's easier than others, but as much as we try and look for that local talent so that to help move us closer and move the perspective a little closer to the one of our partners.
Yeah, I love it. My two big takeaways there. One, no matter how much we deeply care about the people we partner with, the people we serve, the causes of our organizations, we are inherently outsiders to those causes and those people that we serve. So we need to champion the perspective of the insider. But then the other piece of that is, particularly in storytelling, we're likely telling a story because we have an objective to tell it. And rather than telling our story through the lens of someone else, we need to be committed to telling authentic stories from the lens of the person who's telling it. Because I think that's going to be, like you said, it's the ticket to ethical, powerful storytelling. Philippe, thank you so much for your time today. I can't wait to share this episode with everyone and see the splash it makes as it goes live. So thank you for your time. As we wrap, is there a good place for people as they listen to this and go, I want to learn more from this guy? Where's a good place to connect with you going forward?
Sure, yeah. Plantwithpurpose.org is where you can find everything Plant with Purpose, also on social media. And our YouTube channel, I think, has a lot of great examples. You can see some of the videos and the projects I've referenced. So, our video from Ethiopia last year and other things that highlight what our team is doing. For me personally, I try and grab at Philippe Lazaro on any platform I can. Thankfully, I have a less common name, so there's not as much competition for that. So yeah, Instagram I think is where I'm most active, but at Philippe Lazaro, or philippelazaro.com is my website. Thank you so much for having me. This is just the stuff I enjoy talking about. So this was effortless and fun.
Awesome. Now, as a little Easter egg leave behind for those of you who've made it this far in the podcast, Philippe mentioned his Instagram. His Instagram is full of these awesome illustrations and dynamic creativity. Just to, as a bonus leave behind for everyone, will you tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind that, why you started it, what that's about?
Yeah, so I'm an illustrator. And my main subject are just humans, which I think is kind of the tie into my work. Is I love drawing human portraits and people, and my subjects are all over the place. I think they're as eclectic as my interests. I think I'm just thumbing through my most recent drawings. I have these mud wrestlers who I met in India one time. I have Ben Schwartz, the comedian, and Joel Embiid. So, but I think I really started illustrating. It was a pandemic hobby of mine that just never stopped. And where it really started was, as a lot of upheaval was going on in the world, I would make illustrations that were at least somewhat related to that were close to communities that were being affected by all kinds of injustices that were happening. And I started to feel like just moving a pen back and forth almost felt like a different version of prayer beads to me. It was just something that like kind of helped me channel some goodwill. And even when I couldn't quite find words to like respond to the intensity of some things, just being able to draw it out became responsive. And I think I've been just curious about where my own practice is going. Obviously some pieces are really lighthearted, others are more serious, and sometimes I might try and portray things in a different way than it's used to be seen. But these days I think I just have been leaning into the eclecticness of it and just the different directions that it's going in, because that's kind of how life is. Some parts are really heavy and you want to call attention to a series of injustice. Sometimes you're in a goofy mood, and any person holds all of that.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Philippe. This was awesome.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.